Big Brother is watching you.
Oh.
Listeners, you are warned. This program is not to be listened to.
Welcome to 1984 Today, your one-stop shop for all things dystopian. I'm your host, Mike Friedman. Our guest today is the author and journalist Jonathan Meyerson Katz, a contributor to The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Republic, The New Yorker, all the news. He's a real newsman. He reported for Associated Press on the Pentagon, the Middle East, the Dominican Republic, and the Haitian earthquake of 2010. The last topic included covering the UN's role in causing a cholera outbreak after the earthquake, which culminated in the UN admitting responsibility because of his work. He's won the Medill Medal for Courage in Journalism and a National Headliners Award. His most recent book is called Gangsters of Capitalism, tracing the life of General Smedley Butler of War is a Racket fame, and he also writes The Racket, which you can find at theracket.news. On November 28, 2023, The Atlantic published an article in its Ideas section by Jonathan called Substack Has a Nazi Problem. In it, he describes and takes issue with the ways in which extremist and racist content is published on Substack, often for paying subscribers. Around that time, I had already invited Elle Griffin to come on the podcast as a guest to discuss her work writing utopian fiction and nonfiction. It just so happened that Elle also wrote an open letter in defense of Substack's walled garden approach to content moderation, in opposition to what was perceived as the more censorious angle in Jonathan's article. Jonathan was kind enough to listen to the episode, and he reached out, so we're here together to discuss his perspective on the issue and hopefully a little more besides. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, I suppose what I would like to kick off with is I'd love to know how your article in The Atlantic came about. Was it something you pitched, something you were researching yourself? Was it a commission from them? How did it spring forth?
Yeah, it was a pitch. The way the sort of the backstory, it really came out of reporting that I'd done over the summer of 2023 about Substack, on my Substack, on the Racket. The co-founder of Substack, Hamish McKenzie, had on what was at that moment the Substack flagship podcast. I think the podcast has kind of gone dormant since then, called The Active Voice. He had as a guest a guy named Richard Hanania, who some of your listeners may be familiar with. He was billed as an enlightened centrist, or somebody who was promoting enlightened centrism. But I happen to know a little bit about Richard Hanania, really from social media, from seeing him on Twitter. He describes himself, I think, somewhat facetiously, somewhat self-defensively as a troll. But he is not a centrist. I also don't think he's particularly enlightened. And he says extremely racist things. He holds extremely racist views about the inherent criminality of Black people, the inherent differences in intelligence between races, things that are just sort of, definitionally old school, like, early mid 20th century racism.
Ideas that might be described as vintage.
Vintage, yes, yes, I would say that. And I was a little put off by the fact that Hamish had him on the podcast, and the way that it was a very kid's glove kind of interview. I'm not, it's well, I can get into sort of the nitty gritty of my thoughts about that, but the suffice it to say, I just thought that look, it would make a good newsletter to talk about what does this guy actually believe. And what did he actually talk about during that podcast? And his main thrust was promoting his main intellectual project of late, which has been to call for the repeal of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, or the gutting of the Civil Rights Act, I think he would probably say. And at the end of that interview, Hamish asked Hanania to recommend some other Substacks that he thought that, listeners might be interested in. And he recommended two white nationalists, one of whom is a self-described, Danish-German ethno-nationalist, and the other one is sort of opinions vary, but he I think is very, very clearly somebody who promotes a white supremacist worldview. So I wrote about that. It got some attention. That ended up creating some sort of follow-on reporting that I did about this sort of shady nonprofit that Hanania runs. While I was doing that reporting that I did prompted an expose in the Huffington Post, which revealed that not only was Hanania a racist on Maine on his Twitter feed today, but 10 years before, he had written even more extreme, even more explicitly racist and explicitly genocidal writings under a pen name. And when I say genocidal, his specific form of genocide, and this is genocide under the convention, under the UN Convention on Genocide, was calling for the forced sterilization of people who he considers low IQ, which to him includes Black and Latino people. So I was like, okay, that's even worse than I thought. And the thing that I was like, what will Substack do with this? What will they do with this information? And they were already, not responding to many requests for comment that I had made. And I should say, as a backstory, I had been on Substack for 4.5 years, almost 5 years at that point. I joined at the personal invitation of Hamish McKenzie. We were never friends, but like we would, just because we didn't meet each other, we lived in different places, but we would correspond cordially on a fairly regular basis, sometimes over the phone. I have his phone number, and he was just, ghosting me. He wasn't responding to comment. And I was like, well, maybe he'll comment on this. Maybe this definitely seems to be even more fuel to the fire in the case that, he had erred in presenting him as an enlightened centrist. To use that quote. But instead, Substack doubled down. Hanania wrote this sort of non-apology on his Substack in which he, it was sort of an apology.
Words were said.
Yeah, it was like an apology shaped piece. It was the sort of thing that you would look at and be like, oh, this is timed like an apology. This is formatted like an apology. But if you actually looked at what he said, he wasn't apologizing for anything. He was saying, I was wrong for calling for forced sterilization. I don't think he used those specific terms, but you can sort of read between the lines. And I'm embarrassed that I was, he was writing for extreme, neo-Nazi, alt-right, including literally alternativeright.com. He wrote for that at the invitation of Richard Spencer. And he certainly wanted to distance himself from that. He also had a book coming out at the time. But in that non-apology, he said that he was the victim of a cancellation effort by liberal journalists who objected to discussing, I forget the exact words that he used, but it was essentially like the inherent statistical differences, I think, between races. So essentially, they don't like the fact that I think that races are different, biologically different from one another. They don't like the fact that I'm racist. And Substack just, they doubled down again. They praised this non-apology, and then they continued promoting his work, including his then upcoming book, which came out with HarperCollins. And it was around that time that other people who were, readers of The Racket started sending me, they were like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but there are actual literal Nazi publications on Substack. And when I say actual literal, I'm talking about Heil Hitler, here's a swastika or a black sun, Jews are parasites. It's very, very Nazi. This is not
swastikas, side partings, and knee-length boots.
Right. This is not, this was these were not edge cases. They were like you should know that these things are out there. And I was trying to figure out, like, well, what do I do with this? So first, I started doing more research. I started looking for, and a lot of the research that I was doing was just using Substack's own recommendations feature to see what other people like recommending things that are similar to their points of view. I did the same thing. And I was like, well, so who are the Nazis recommending? I was like, oh, they're recommending other Nazis. And also they're recommending, Shocker. Yes. And they're also recommending, eugenics blogs. They're recommending, just sort of general white supremacist, anti-Semitic stuff.
People who read Adolf Hitler also read Herbert Spencer. Yeah,
exactly.
Kind of thing.
Exactly. Quite.
Sure.
And I was like, what do I do with this? So I had a couple of thoughts. My first thought was, well, I'll make a post out of this. Like I will put this on my Substack. And we're talking sort of late summer. It was like September, I think, of 23. And at that point I reached out again. I had sort of just become, I don't know about omnipresent, but I was sort of like periodically, every time something came up, when there was this having to post expose, etc. I would write Hamish, I'd write Chris Best, who's the Substack CEO, and I'd be like, so what's your response to this? So in September, I was like, look, guys, I have found some really, really, really aggressive stuff. Really, this is stuff that. And we'll get into sort of my feelings about and what I was going for, but like in the most extreme cases here, like it just seemed very clear to me, like it seems like this is you have in your terms of service you don't allow hate, and it seems like a newsletter that calls itself like a National Socialist newsletter and has as its entrance graphic the Brandenburg Gate during like Hitler's birthday celebration in like 1936 or something like that, with like swastika banners hung from it. It seems like that might violate your terms of service. I can't speak for you.
It might be hate adjacent.
It might be hate adjacent. I can't, and I'm like, I'm trying to like, maybe I sound facetious, but I'm like, I can't speak for you guys. I need you to speak for yourselves. Like, what is going on here? What's happening here? And they didn't respond. And then I was like, okay, so I'm a journalist, right? And I'm like, oh, all right, so I've got information here. I think it's interesting. I think people should know about it. Also, the only people who can really answer this question about like what their policy is and like what their vision for Substack is, what they're doing, are the Substack founders, who, despite the fact that we used to trade emails frequently, and the fact that I've like bought into their, crowdfunding project when their Series C fundraising round failed, have decided, new phone who dis. I was like, well, okay, so one way to do this is to put this in a national publication. And, for anyone who is listening who doesn't know how this works, it is not, for some people who are on like sort of contracts or who work for a place and they sort of have a regular piece, they might need the editor to buy in on their idea, but like they can get things in more easily. I'm a freelance journalist. I don't work for the Atlantic. I don't work for the New Yorker. I don't work for any of the other places that I've written for. I have done work for them, but I don't work. I'm not on staff. I don't work for them. So I pitched a couple of different places. And the Atlantic bit. They were like, this sounds interesting. What do you got? And we talked about it, and I, put together a draft, and it went through various iterations. And then ultimately took a lot of editing. World events intervened, both on my end and theirs, in terms of things that were also drawing our interest. And the piece ended up coming out, as you said, in late November. So after several months of work. And, it was only that. It was only having this piece published in the Atlantic that got Substack to come out of their shell at all and make any kind of comment. And it was a fairly anodyne comment. But that was it. And I put the piece out, and we can talk about what's happened since.
Well, I suppose then maybe before we get into what the result of the publishing of the article was in terms of pushback and responses that you received, something that I think might be useful, I know I'd like to know, and I think it would be useful at this point as well, is for you yourself. You're a journalist. Your job is writing things often, as your track record shows, that some people don't want to hear and would probably prefer weren't published. So what kind of end game did you have in mind, if you had one in mind at all, for publishing the article? So, for instance, what I mean by that is one of the interpretations of the article, and I say interpretations because you're here, it's for you to say, but one of the interpretations is that it was essentially either pushing for or calling for or kind of implicitly suggesting that it would be better if certain types of content were banned centrally, were prevented from being published, or were demonetized, de-amplified, and so forth. I'm not saying you meant to say that, but reading the article and from what people who I have spoken to about it said, that was definitely an implication they picked up from it. So from you, what did you have in mind when you were writing it? What were you trying to get Substack to say when you ended up publishing the article because they didn't say anything to you before?
My goal is somewhat narrowly construed. And I think, it's a thing that often informs my journalism in general, is that I wasn't making a policy prescription. I very rarely do. You were talking, sort of in the intro about my reporting on the cholera epidemic in Haiti after the earthquake, right? It was an epidemic that ended up killed 10,000 people, maybe several multiples of that. The sort of estimates vary. And at the time, I was getting, sort of similar questions from people at the UN, people at the CDC, at the WHO, people in even in my own news organization, at the Associated Press, who I did work for at the time as a full-time employee. What are you trying to do? I was like, I'm trying to figure out what caused the cholera epidemic, and why they seem to be, and why there are all these, why there seems to be a cover up, why there are contradictions, and so on. I didn't have, out of that reporting, a movement sprung up that I wasn't part of, except as somebody who was sort of informing it as a journalist, to get reparations for the cholera victims in Haiti, for both people who were sickened and the families of people who died. But I wasn't like, my first piece wasn't, UN caused cholera in Haiti, reparations needed, right? It was just, there seems to be something happening at this UN base. The UN says that there's nothing happening here, but I went to the base, and it seems like there's evidence here that there was some kind of sewage leak, and that a cholera epidemic seems to have come from here, right? And it's sort of similar here. Like, all I had was a surprising and somewhat shocking to me number of white supremacist, white nationalist, absolute, literal neo-Nazi, some neo-Confederate, those guys exist still in the world, newsletters out there on Substack. And I thought people should know about it. And I wanted to know what Substack's policy was about it, so that then I'm a Substacker, right? So I could make a decision about what to do with my newsletter, so other people could make decisions about what to do with theirs. If you read the piece, which some people who've criticized it have,
other people saw the headline and then got mad. Yes,
exactly.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And there's a paywall. I get it. I mean, there's, and everybody's busy, but if you read the piece, I think it's it comes through, or at least I tried to make it come through, that I'm somewhat ambivalent about the question of deplatforming and kicking people offline in general. I quote...
it was Whitney Phillips, was it?
Whitney Phillips, yeah. She's a professor at the University of Oregon. She's done a lot of work on online extremism. She wrote a very helpful document called The Oxygen of Amplification. And, I quote her in the piece being like, banning people from social media platforms, which Substack is one, often backfires. It makes them feel like victims. It inspires sometimes new people to rush to their cause. It can be a fundraising opportunity. On the other hand, there is evidence out there that to a certain extent and for certain kinds of speech and certain kinds of situations, deplatforming works. It keeps hateful ideologies from gaining steam. These are not simple questions. And because of that, I wasn't proposing a simple answer. In fact, I can tell you that, in my conversations with my editors at The Atlantic, they were, I was like, look, I'm not writing a piece that's like the following newsletters should be banned from Substack. And they were like, look, but you have to take a position on this because people are going to read it as if you are
That's
saying
interesting.
this,
So
right?
it was the editorial discussion around how to position the article and tone it that
in part
they
in part.
encouraged you to not slant, but to have a position rather than to say this is happening and people should know and feel the way they feel about it.
I mean, look, I stand by the piece entirely. Like it's not that I'm not trying to throw my editors on.
No, sure, but it's curious. It's interesting for me to hear that. Yeah. So I can tell you as I remember it, like there's a line in there. This I think at the end of a section that's like, if a National Socialist newsletter doesn't violate Substack's policy against hate speech, like what does? That I think was a line that was suggested to me by the editor. Now the fact that it's in there is in large part because I was like, yeah, it's a good point. And like a lot of people there are people who don't agree or don't agree with sort of the entire conversation or don't want to have had this conversation. And they'll just sort of say kind of like almost offhandedly, I'm thinking of like a newsletter that I subscribe to, who is staying on Substack. And he kind of said as sort of like a throwaway line sort of at the end. He was like, look, I think probably these Nazis shouldn't be on Substack. I agree with that. But he was also sort of like, but I'm also not going to like lose a lot of sleep over it, was sort of his point of view. And it's part of the thing that I think, helped make it I thought a better and more robust and more thoughtful piece, was that I expressed, some ambivalence. I talked about sort of arguments for and against. I talk about in the piece the contradictions of deplatforming online. I talk about the fight over Palestinian voices in what I consider to be, and I've written at length about, an ongoing genocide in Gaza being perpetuated by Israel. And I was like, look, these aren't straightforward issues. But I thought it was important to at least know what we're talking about and what's out there. And then, people can have conversations and Substack can, make its position clear, which ultimately they did. And then people can decide what to do with that. I know it upset a lot of people and I was cognizant of the fact that it would, but nonetheless, like I thought it was important to have the information out there. Well, look, I mean, first of all, I think the speed with which people get upset about insert thing here these days, I don't think the fact that someone gets upset about something is grounds to regret putting it out there. So, and especially because, as we've mentioned before, you're a journalist's job, or at least a key part of a good journalist's job, is to say things people don't want to hear in places where people don't want them to be. And that cuts both ways. It should cut both ways if we're going to have a robust and honest conversation about anything, right?
And I should also add, one thing that I was cognizant of for myself was that I wasn't doing myself economically any favors by drawing attention to a serious problem on the platform where I publish. And I was also aware, and this ended up happening, that other people would note that there could be an economic downside for them and get very mad at me. And I think honestly that's a large part of what has happened. I mean, I think people, even from right from the beginning, it wasn't within like the first 48 hours, but pretty close to the publication. Matt Taibbi wrote a very angry piece in which he, just tried to fling excrement at me. And part of what I was taking from his piece there, which I wrote a response to, was that he recognized that this could have a negative effect on his financial bottom line. He, even to a much greater extent than almost anybody, is extremely financially invested in Substack, the brand. And so he was going to defend the brand, and he defended the brand using the language that a certain group of Substackers and, to a certain extent, the founders used to defend themselves and to promote themselves. That essentially they see Substack as a corrective to the mainstream media. They see it as a tool or a weapon in kind of a sort of dissident discourse, and that they are champions of free speech and free inquiry, and that whatever you want to call it, the regime, the cathedral, the people have different terms.
Gatekeepers, ivory towers,
the
intelligentsia, coastal elites, etc.
10 years ago, it was the lamestream media, the MSM, right?
Lamestream is not my least favorite pun, though. It's pretty good.
It's fine. I mean, it's also accurate often. But I mean, yes, a lot of it is very extremely lame. But regardless, that essentially, that and the fact that I was the fact that I had published this in The Atlantic, which is a publication that I have had much criticism for over the years, I think well-founded, it left me open to it left the article open to that positioning. Oh, look, here comes the big establishment. They're trying to crush little Matt Taibbi, who is like the most mainstream of, I mean, he has like a regular spot on an HBO talk show. He makes millions of dollars off of. He is as established. He testifies in front of Congress on a fairly regular basis. He is extremely established. He's extremely mainstream, and it is a very specific lane of the mainstream. But he has to, he brands himself as a dissident, and so here he is, the little dissidents, and here I am, the big Atlantic writer, trying to crush the little guy. And I don't think that's accurate. I don't think it's a particularly good argument if you actually look at the facts, but it's also extremely effective branding. And if you think that your bottom line is going to be affected by some sort of criticism against the platform that you are on, why not pull it out? It's right there in the quiver. And so I think that drove a lot, that, and he helped, lay the groundwork for it. That has driven a lot of the discourse, the capital D discourse around my piece and what's come since.
Well, since you brought up the question of a bottom line, something that it would be remiss not to mention, but I'm not bringing it up because I'm arguing that it is a major part of it or could be. Obviously, there is a tussle, so to speak, between what probably the most acceptable term these days is the legacy media and the so-called new media, which is to say basically maybe not even that independent because it's still paid for by someone or by subscribers. And in the end, people will naturally end up creating content that people want to see because otherwise they won't pay for it. So there's a lot of arguments that come up that are kind of true until someone succeeds to the point where they need to give the people what they want because there are enough people that they need that money. So I'm not kind of saying that anyone is worse or better than anyone else in that regard. But The Atlantic is a very well-recognized brand in the so-called legacy media.
Yep.
And it is, if we were to assume a kind of zero-sum, limited amount of time and eyeballs scenario, it is in competition with what is perceived as the new or newer media. And it's not totally missed my notice that since your article, just on, I think it was the 12th of January, The Atlantic published another piece specifically about Substack by Jacob Stern. And so I suppose in the question of the bottom line, people who, as you say, may be defensive of Substack because they don't want it to be seen as a haven for Nazis because that's also where they live and they don't want people feeling dirty subscribing to them there. And that's one possible motivation for people to be defensive. But at the same time, it's also a motivation for someone who's in competition with that platform to attack it. Do you think that's a reasonable observation?
I mean, I don't know. This is going to sound crazy to some people. People who come to this from a certain point of view. First of all, the legacy media is dying. And to a large extent, it is dead. There's very little of it left. You can look at the statistics, you can look at the number of jobs that are out there. But suffice it to say, there was some statistic that I saw recently, and I'm maybe getting this completely wrong, but it was something like, it was like a quarter of all journalists who are employed in the United States right now are employed by the New York Times, or it was something crazy like that. Maybe I'm getting this completely wrong, but it was something along those lines, because there aren't jobs, but the couple of survivors, and there's a very small number of them, and really the Times is the biggest of all of them, because the Times is really at this point it's essentially like a gaming company with like a news annex. I mean, it's like
it really is that, like, please.
It really is. It's like, it's essentially like people subscribe to the Times to play Wordle and spelling bee and get recipes. And then like and then it's like an added bonus to their subscription. They get, the news package, and
it's like getting video with Prime from Amazon.
Exactly. And they get, I mean, the
news is the excuse to subscribe, but not the reason.
This is deeper than we may want to get. This is also how it's always worked. I mean, like people used to subscribe to newsletters to get coupons and sports scores and classified ads. And then, they would get with that, news that they were sometimes interested in and sometimes not. But certainly the news didn't tend to pay for itself. It was the fact of the publication, of the distribution of the paper product that had ads in it that really is what funded the whole enterprise.
Yeah, it was the thing around the advertising that justified it not just being a supermarket freebie giveaway. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, this is why journalists we wrote the filler between ads on its way to becoming birdcage liner and fish wrap. I mean, many people have said that. This is not original to me. That's how it used to work. And the New York Times is sort of alone in having figured out like a way to sort of, somewhat jury rig a model of that in the 21st century. The Atlantic, I think, to a lesser extent, it seems to be a survivor at this point. But there are a lot of Atlantic writers. I mean, I can tell you like offhand because I was reading him last night. James Fallows, longtime Atlantic writer. Probably, I think he's still on staff. He has a Substack. I don't think that these things are necessarily in competition with one another. I know that from being sort of an elder millennial who was in the news industry during the rise of social media, a lot of news properties, a lot of news organizations looked at social media as being a competition for them. And then they realized very quickly that it was actually an asset for them. And then they had really kind of mixed feelings about it because it was also giving their individual reporters too much power and was making them into public figures who was harder to boss around and whose labor was harder for them to exploit, et cetera. So a whole lot of things here. So, but I guess I want to like just this. I know this sounds like crazy. And the fact that it's coming from somebody who had a byline recently in the Atlantic. I think I've written something like 5 articles for them over 8 years or something like that. And they interviewed me once. But that somebody who has in their mind is associated with the Atlantic is, it sounds like I sound like, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Right. It's like, oh, don't worry, little girl. I'm your friend. It's like, right. But I mean, like the fact is that the news industry is dying. It is being murdered. It is being murdered by some of the same people who are, the big investors in social media platforms and Substack. And it is creating a place where journalists like myself, I mean, again, I was on Substack. I recently left. I'm on Beehive now, but I was on Substack from 2019 from back when people were like, they had no idea what Substack was. And the fact that I was writing a newsletter, they were like, you're doing a what? Who? What? Like this didn't compute. And that has changed to a certain extent. Still, I had a conversation this week with somebody where I just dropped the word Substack in the conversation. They were like, oh, what? So it still happens. So I don't think that I have not seen evidence. Maybe I'll put it this way, like a little bit more journalistically. I don't see evidence that, the Atlantic feels threatened by Substack, that people are not subscribing to the Atlantic and they're going to newsletters instead. Maybe they do. I don't know. Maybe you can get Jeffrey Goldberg to come onto your podcast and he will talk about that. But
who knows?
I don't see any evidence of that because, among other things, anything that allows, so the actual business model that these surviving legacy publications thrive on is their ability to underpay freelancers to continually be coming to them with content and competing against other freelancers in ways that keep prices down. And the way that is possible for them to do that is for us to not all starve to death. And so we have to have some way that we are putting food in our refrigerators. And Substack is a way to do that. So if Substack or newsletters or Patreon or, buy me a coffee or whatever modes freelance journalists have to stay alive and allow us to keep working. If all of those things went away, a magazine like The Atlantic wouldn't have content because they would be forced to rely. Maybe this is less true for the Atlantic than others, but I think it's probably true for them as well. Like they would then be forced to rely on their full-time employees who require living wages and benefits and parental leave and and all these other things, right?
Or LLMs.
Right. Exactly. Which so far the Atlantic has not, I believe, succumbed to, but others are. And so that could happen. That could definitely happen. I don't know if the Atlantic would go for that, but the Sports Illustrated recently got caught using AI for articles that nobody reads because Sports Illustrated barely existed anymore, even before it just got killed in the nursing home.
Well, can I ask then, just on that line of reasoning, there's competition in a bottom line financial way, as you've spoken to, but then we recently had a representative of the Wall Street Journal, I think it was, speaking at Davos, who said that something along the line, I'm not going to pretend to have it verbatim, but something along the lines of, we used to control the narrative and the facts, and now we don't anymore. And we have to accept that. Now, I'm not saying that to put words in her mouth in terms of what she might mean by the narrative or by facts. And I'm not suggesting that it means that outlets like the WSJ were lying about things. I'm not getting into that. I guess what I'm saying is there's competition for money, but then there's also kind of competition for ecosystem dominance. In terms of when someone says something, who is it that people listen to? Who believes the source of the message? And in a way we get into this kind of reputational territory, which is also something I'm curious about, which is more to do with what I see as perhaps a less genteel way of doing journalism, where people, as they say in soccer terminology, tend to play the man and not the ball, which we can get onto in a moment. So I guess, where do you think the legacy media, which, as you say, are potentially thrashing around trying to plug a leak that they can't plug financially, but are also seeing their real influence wane over the way that society tells itself the stories that give it a coherent sense of what is happening?
I mean, I don't know who this person was that you're referencing or what she said.
I'll tell you what, if you give me a second, I'll just look it up. I can cut out the pause.
Sure.
Because I don't want to misspeak. But it was a direct quote. I saw the actual video clip.
If you go back really not that long ago, as I say, we owned the news. We were the gatekeepers, and we very much owned the facts as well. If it said it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, then that was a fact. Nowadays, people can go to all sorts of different sources for the news, and they're much more questioning about what we're saying. So it's no longer good enough for us just to say, this is what happened, or this is the news. We have to explain our working. So readers expect to understand how we source stories. They want to know how we go about getting stories. We have to sort of lift the bonnet, as it were, and in a way that newspapers aren't used to doing, and explain to people what we're doing. We need to be much more transparent about how we go about collecting the news.
I think that she's saying that there is more distrust. There's always been a lot of distrust in the media, but she's saying, and some of that has been weaponized. Some of it I saw this coming, a decade and a half ago, even before Trump, with Sarah Palin, where it was from my point of view, it was like, of course, it was a politician saying, I don't like the people who report on me. I don't like the people who talk about things that I don't want them to talk about. So don't read them. Listen to me. And she could use new technologies in which she could basically had her own printing press and her own television studio in the form of, Facebook at the time and Twitter. And she could just, go directly, unmediated to the people. But of course, what that meant was, she's a politician. Politicians lie. And so it was like, of course, I can lie and I can spin and I can say whatever I want directly to my fans. And there are deeper political dynamics that have grown over the decades. A lot of it comes out of just sort of still seething conservative anger over Watergate and what they see as a president being taken down by the media. And Roger Ailes at that moment comes up with a plan called, Put the GOP on TV, which becomes Fox News under his watch. And the idea is that we're never going to let the Washington Post. This is a very it's a very oversimplified version of what happened in Watergate, but essentially from their point of view, it was like, we're never going to let the Washington Post take down another Republican president. We're going to have our own sources of information, and we are going to sow mistrust, and we're going to create doubt. And this works in large part because it dovetails very nicely with journalistic ethics and journalists' own conception of ourselves. So I don't know Emma Tucker. I had actually never, I'm showing my ignorance here that I didn't know who the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal was, but I hadn't even heard of her until you brought up this quote. I don't know how long she's been in her job for. Let me see. Looks like, 2022. That's why. So it's not that long ago. Late 2022. Anyway, it dovetails very nicely with journalists because we, in our conception of ourselves, right? We have all these pithy sayings that you learn in journalism school. If your mother says she loves you, check it out, right? Get a second source. Don't never assume. If assuming makes an ass out of you and me, right? All these fun things that we all say to each other. And we're constantly checking our own work. We're checking our colleagues' work. Go back to Watergate. I mean, in those halcyon days of yore, you had, the competition to the Washington Post, which was, primarily the New York Times. A lot of the ways that they were in the story and they ended up doing very significant work on it as well was because they were in competition. They were trying to beat them. They were also trying to catch them in mistakes. This is a thing. All the Haiti cholera story. I mean, I had pushback from, as I noted earlier, from within AP. The AP correspondents who were closer to senior officials at the UN and things like that. They were like, are you sure? We've got this guy in Haiti. He's a kid. He's saying all these crazy things. How could the UN have brought cholera to Haiti? I was like, well, here are the facts. And well, are you sure about this? What about that? That fact maybe is wrong. I was like, well, but no, it's right. And here are my, this is what we do. Right. And so it was sort of it was kind of knocking on an open door for people who wanted to sow mistrust, to pull from within the profession, the kinds of sort of mistrust and maybe not mistrust, but skepticism that is built into the profession, and to exploit that. And the thing is that, and I think this is kind of what Tucker is saying here, but it's certainly what I'm saying. That's what I've been saying for years. And I've taught journalism and I've studied journalism. I've been a journalist for over 2 decades now. The only thing that we have to sell ultimately is trust, right? Because ultimately, especially in print, although increasingly also in visual media, especially with the rise of AI and deepfakes, the only thing that at the end of the day, if I go to a UN base and I see leaking sewage, the only way that that I'm telling the truth is if you trust me. and I've earned your trust, and I'm sort of re-earning your trust in the story, right? I've got transparent sourcing, I have facts that can be checked, etc. And
also issuing timely and open and accepting corrections.
Yes.
And owning errors, right?
Yes. Yeah. And yes. But even then, people whose game is to sow mistrust will then try to exploit those structures and those modes of operating. I mean, I can tell you, again, as a journalist, every time I've done a story especially about a powerful individual or a powerful entity, a powerful corporation,
organization,
the first thing that they do is try to find something wrong in the story so they can get a correction. And it doesn't matter how minor it is, and they try to get a correction appended to it so that they can point to it and say, well, see, it was that person wasn't careful. It was they were erroneous. I can just one example. For years I ended up reporting a lot on Duke Energy. It's a power company in the southern United States, and they were just relentless. Anytime I wrote about them, I started covering them because there was a big coal ash spill in North Carolina. And and they were just relentless. They would just go through every story with a fine tooth comb, and they don't even really care if it's true. Another story I wrote.
You said it was potassium nitrate, but it was actually potassium citrate.
Exactly. Stuff like that. I did a story in the New York Times Magazine about violence and sort of a threatened and partially carried out ethnic cleansing against people of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. It was a big feature. And the Dominican government, they came with a list of, a lot of them were just complete. It was just complete BS. Like it wasn't true, or they were just like over interpreting or whatever. It didn't matter what it was. They just wanted to get, and I don't think any of them even got in. Maybe there was a correction. You'd have to look, but this was like an 8,000 word story. And if they can just be like, well, you spelled the name wrong, then they can use that. So it's, again,
these are he issued a correction. What else did he get wrong? That kind of thing.
Yeah. But I feel like you're going somewhere with this. So I'm happy to go there with you.
Not so much in terms of me having a roadmap, but I suppose, how would I put it? So I'll give you an example. Going back to your article in The Atlantic, I agree with you that, first of all, at least I'm not a published in mainstream journals guy, but writers don't choose their own titles a lot of the time. They may not decide where the paragraph breaks are. They may be subheadings put in that kind of give it a slightly spicier tone, and that may all be done by sub-editors or editors. So sometimes people read an article and they think it's saying something, or they think it's taking a tone which is actually kind of added in or implied by something that the writer didn't necessarily intend. And so I think a kind of slightly more patient and generous way of reading in general is probably more helpful.
Right.
And that's my personal view. And the reason I have that is because what I see is a tendency for a kind of combative tone. Exactly as you say, a kind of jumping on people, maybe not even if they misspeak, but because they hold a certain position, a kind of pile-on mentality that, as you say, these things have been around for a while. We've always had hysterias and mass panics and public sentiment swinging one way or the other. And this isn't new, but the age of the internet has amplified these factors. But I suppose where I sit is I feel like maybe I am middle enough in terms of many of my views and opinions that I don't see it as a malaise or a malady of only one, quote, side, end quote. And so I think what I feel is that there's a kind of elevated sense of stakes that, for whatever reason, especially over the past maybe 5 years, 8 years, something like that, it really does seem like when people write whatever it is, opinion pieces, essays, anything but like totally straight reporting, it's like they're fighting something, as if they're afraid of what the consequences will be if this is not the hill they die on. And on the other hand, people who take the contra position will therefore be attacking the person. In a way, it's kind of taken on more of the atmosphere of a battle or a war rather than the atmosphere of a lot of people bound by curiosity, interest, and professional ethics, trying very hard to find out what actually happened and making sure they tell it to people in the clearest language possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely defensive writing. There's a lot of defensive writing. I mean, this has always been the case to a certain extent, but social media especially exacerbated that. I mean, I think that, and I say this as somebody who, will screenshot and post a screenshot anytime, but screenshotting, for instance, has I think, is created a defensive mentality where it's like, you can't even trust that the context of everything that came before and after it in the piece is going to be allowed to stand on its own, is going to be allowed to color the thing that is because somebody is just going to, and I've even written, I forget what it was, but I wrote a thing, not that long ago, where I made a comment. I think it was in a newsletter. It was like, I can feel the cursor, hovering over this paragraph and making a screenshot as we speak, because it's just like, you just know that somebody's going to just grab a line or a paragraph and they're going to put it in, on Twitter or Substack notes or whatever platform, and they're going to be like, here it is, pile on. And it's a really bad way to write. It changes the way that people write, because then you have to be like, each individual paragraph has to be as airtight as you can make it, but then you also have to be sort of
absolute.
Not just that, but you also have to be anticipating all of the different things that all of these different groups of readers are going to bring to a piece. And that's impossible. Like, you can't know what every single person or every single group, and sometimes, you'll say something and you'll be like, I'm airtight here. I'm making the case. I'm even, taking, this contrary position into account. And and there's this other position or whatever that just completely blindsides you. It can be infuriating.
Well, and it's a tactic that I don't see being a partisan issue. I think it's a tendency of people arguing with each other. And so parsing the point scoring, playing the man, not the ball stuff from good faith debate, which can be heated, which can be contentious and controversial, and sometimes isn't clear. It can be a gray area of responsibility and fault, and humans are complicated. It's not as simple as flicking a light switch to figure out what happened. If
you identify as somebody as being on your team or against your team in any given situation, that will also color the things that they say. And so if they say something that you agree with, you'd be like, well, they didn't mean that. Or they meant that, but it was, but it's overwhelmed by all of this other stuff. And then if they say something that you dislike, then it's off to the races.
Well, and also there's in a way a kind of a framing issue, as you brought it up. A good example, in a way, specific to where we began our conversation. Mm-hmm. One of the responses to your article in The Atlantic was an open letter from, I think, over 200 people who were on Substack, so-called Substackers,
right?
Who wrote and circulated an open letter called Substackers Against Nazis. Mm-hmm. And to me, while I understand that that's a very clear declarative title that stakes a claim to your position,
right,
I also felt that it was an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is that I don't sincerely believe that the people who, for instance, signed Elle Griffin's open letter are Substackers for Nazis.
Right.
But if one takes a position on an issue and says, I'm anti-fascist, Once you say that, anyone who's arguing with you is linguistically pro-fascist because they're against your anti-fascist position. Now, that doesn't make them that.
Right.
And it doesn't make you anti-fascist either for calling yourself that. But it's a way of framing debate which I feel plays into this kind of more heated, more adversarial, less productive way of talking to each other. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. What I can tell you is, so, and you know, to be fully transparent, so I didn't create the Substackers Against Nazis.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying you
movement.
did at all. Yeah.
But I did. I posted it on my newsletter, and I was glad to see it. And I was, you know, in touch with Marissa Kabas, who is the Substack writer. She's also since left the platform. Who you know, was behind that effort. So I'm aware of the timeline of it, and I can tell you that letter was done, and was being rolled out before the Elle Griffin letter.
That they were kind of simultaneous, maybe, or
they were simultaneous from the point of view of the people who you know, or at least a lot of the people who shared the Substackers Against Nazis letter. That the Elle Griffin letter read as a kind of a pre-bubble, that they had sort of, you know, gotten out ahead of it. Part of the evidence of that is that, so in the piece that Matt Taibbi wrote, in which he just, you know, tried to have it out with me, I think he called me a tireless busybody or something like that.
Well, you know,
so it was just really fast. So in that post, he talks about the fact that he was aware that there was an open letter that was in the works. So they knew about the open letter that the Substackers Against Nazis were doing. But I'm pretty sure, I don't know what every single person who ended up sharing the Substackers Against Nazis letter knew. But I didn't know until Elle's letter, or the letter on Elle's blog came out. I didn't know that there was going to be this competing letter the day before, and it seemed like they were very quick.
Yeah, so
to
it wasn't.
try to get it out ahead.
But that's
which is to say, and I listened to, as you know, and as you noted, your interview with Elle. You know, I think she sort of implied or said at some point that, you know, calling that letter the Substackers Against Nazis was a comment on her letter. But it wasn't. It was a comment. It was a comment on Nazis. It was building off of my reporting.
No, and by the way, I that's good. That's a good piece of additional context to have. But in a way, it's also, and that's not. I'm not saying people shouldn't have called it that. I'm not shooting on anyone. But just going back to this point about how we speak to each other, how we write, how we try and elucidate the situation in the world around us.
Yeah.
Again, like with Matt Taibbi, I've read Matt Taibbi for a long time. I'm a big fan of his writing. I think he's a fantastic journalist. He's broken some great stories. He wrote one of my favorite phrases in the English language when he called Goldman Sachs a giant vampire squid on the face of humanity, jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. Word poetry, diamonds. And he's also been very active working on issues around, I'm going to say censorship because that's the simplest word for it, but talking about what happened under the bonnet at Twitter and so forth. And so I think and you called him out earlier saying that he's kind of big time. He's testified in front of Congress, but in context, he testified in front of Congress specifically about the censorship issue with the so-called Twitter files. He was asked to go there by a House committee, and he was actually called a so-called journalist by one of the people who were on that committee who didn't like what he was saying. Right. And while he was there, the IRS went to his house and left him a threatening letter, which made no sense because they actually owed him money. It's a very kind of muddy situation for him. Yes. So again, That's kind of what I mean.
And that reporting that he was doing was he was effectively given documents by a billionaire who was trying to create a narrative at the company that he had just bought.
Yes, that's
Taibbi has done good journalism before. He lost me at one point, but
that's fair enough. And no, but that's what I mean. Like I'm not anyone's PR agent or defender. I guess what I mean is, again, so for instance, the Elon Musk buying Twitter and releasing the Twitter files, right?
Right.
Yes, Elon Musk is a very wealthy man.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are implications of the policy that's happening at Twitter right now, which are worth discussing. I think it's something you mentioned actually in your article to do with censoring on behalf of Turkey and India,
right,
but claiming the mantle of free speech.
Right.
And that is definitely a valid statement, but I don't know if it's an entirely fair characterization, only because I'd say Turkey and India, like China and other countries, often force their own norms around what they permit to be shared in their country onto the companies that transact in their countries. So in essence, it seemed like a kind of loaded statement because I'd rather have a country that was freer, where people get to say stuff even if it's nasty, but if that company is doing business in a more censorious country, they have to be a business and obey the rules of that country, even though I don't like that. I don't like censorship. I don't like that idea. I think the idea that they should censor more because they do it elsewhere, I'm not saying that's what you were saying, but it's one of the kind of shadow parts of the way it was written.
But that's I mean, this is maybe getting a little off topic, but that's the heart of the critique of the so-called Twitter files, right? Is that you had a government who, from the point of view of Elon Musk and the people behind the Twitter files, not all of whom were journalists. I mean, Michael Schellenberger has kind of become a journalist, but he describes himself as a PR professional, and he's been a politician. He is sort of being more of a journalist now, I guess, than he has been. I'm not defending the so-called journalist statement, but in his case, I think it is more appropriate than Taibbi's. But regardless. The critique of the Twitter files was that you had a government that was working with a social media platform, and so it's the same thing. I mean, except it's worse, right? Because in the case of the United States, even in what the Twitter files showed, it showed that they weren't calling the shots. In fact, they were often very frustrated with Twitter for not doing what they wanted. Whereas in the case of Turkey and India in particular, it seems like Elon just did what they wanted, no questions asked. At least until the next tranche of Twitter files comes out.
But also, the Twitter files are from before Elon bought it over.
No, I know. I'm saying that, but if somebody makes public his documents the way that he made the documents of the previous Twitter owners public.
Yeah, and
that he selected or that he handpicked people who he knew were going to tell a story that he wanted told, and then made sure that they had access to pick whatever they wanted that went into the narrative that they wanted told, and that's essentially what comes out of the Twitter files.
Can I ask you a genuinely honest question?
Yeah. If
you had gotten that call, would you have gone?
If I got a call from Elon Musk to work for, no.
Not work for. If you'd gotten a call that just said, I've got a bunch of internal documents from Twitter, and I want to give them to some journalists who can then interpret them and understand them and write about them, as long as the first version of the story is released on Twitter, and after that, run with it to your heart's content. Wouldn't have. No, I don't think. I think honestly, I would have, if he was like, I would have wanted a lot more guarantees of freedom and independence, including the ability to publish it wherever I wanted. They have been able to publish afterwards. It was only, I think, the first as far as I'm aware, the only condition was the first story from each batch of documents should be released on Twitter in the initial round. But since then, I think they've been running with it on their own Substacks. Or
I would have also asked myself a question, which I ask anytime somebody comes to me with information. It's like, why are you coming to this with, why me? Like what because it's clearly there is often implicit in choosing the journalist that you want to tell the story that you want told. You are doing so because you think that they are going to tell the story the way that you want it told.
But that's also true wouldn't that also be true for any journalist who receives a leak from, say, a White House staffer?
Yes.
Or
but
a CIA analyst or something.
But it's generally, just speaking personally, it's generally not the way I work. I generally don't.
Right.
Information that I get is generally not, it's generally not handed to me.
Not from the VIP area.
Yeah. I mean, like, when we were talking about Watergate, I mean, it's really interesting, like, the degree to which, and this only became common knowledge very late in life, once the source known as Deep Throat, Mark Felt, was unmasked, it really comes out the extent to which Bob Woodward's reporting in particular was access journalism, that it was a highly placed source in a government agency sharing information for his own purposes. And then the other people did other reporting. And you've seen that in Bob Woodward's career. So I don't mean to be shitting on Bob Woodward, but like Bob Woodward's career since, like, the things that he has done since Watergate, they tend to be access journalism. They tend to be, he is welcomed into, George W. Bush's White House or the Supreme Court or whatever. And there's a value to that. That's not generally what I do. I'm not somebody who, I don't generally get a call from somebody who's like, I am the CEO of this company. I've got all of my predecessors' emails, and would you like them? Because and part of the reason I don't work that way, and I'm being really honest here, like part of the reason and some people do. I mean, there are good journalists who do. Bob Woodward is one of them. But part of the reason I don't work that way is because it's a mode of work that makes you beholden, whether you like it or not, in a lot of ways, to the person who is giving you the access. Because if you report something that they don't want, your access is cut off, or they will undercut you, or they will give it to your competition, or whatever, and you will just feel, you will feel the impulse to some extent tell a story that they are happy with, and
I agree with you.
I don't like working that way. So I don't think, but also it doesn't matter because he wouldn't have called me.
I agree with your point and your concerns about access journalism. And I think, in a way, going back to this question of how we as a kind of community of people on this planet trying to understand reality as accurately as possible, I'd like to believe that's ultimately our shared goal. Mm-hmm. I don't mean just you and I, but I'm speaking in a general sense. Yeah. That criticism you just made of that type of journalism, mm-hmm. You know who else I've heard make that case very forcefully, very eloquently, and very passionately? Matt Taibbi.
Yeah. Well,
and so the point, and in a way, this is kind of what I mean, is going back to this question of trust, this question of where people get their information. Yeah.
And I think he changed. I mean, this is not a, I don't know. I don't want to get into like a,
no, sure.
Like a long conversation about Matt Taibbi, but I don't think the Matt Taibbi of 20 or 10 years ago and the Matt Taibbi of today are necessary. I'm sure things have remained constant, but people change. I change. I mean, everybody changes. But I don't.
I mean, do you feel that you're? Do you feel?
I don't think the Matt Taibbi of 2008 would have taken an invitation from a billionaire to tell a story on his platform using documents that he was fed. I don't think I've ever actually met Taibbi in person. We've had interactions online. But I don't think he would have done that, but maybe he would. And he can speak for himself. I don't,
Sure.
I feel like we're getting off topic.
No, exactly. So, I mean, to return to maybe something more tightly in the wheelhouse,
Yeah.
I suppose, when you look at the way you've developed as a journalist, the way that you've experienced pushback from organizations or individuals in positions of influence. Mm-hmm. And as you say, we all change, we all develop. And in a way, I think that's something that comes up commonly is the "you've changed man" thing, which is, I'd rather have someone who develops and owns it than insists on a type of consistency that keeps them frozen in amber regardless of what they've learned in the intervening period.
The hobgoblin of little minds.
So I mean, from your perspective, how is what you do changed in terms of the way you choose stories, what you want to focus on, and how you express it? Like we've talked about, right? That sometimes there is a type of internet voice, there's a type of writing that is now kind of required because of the tone of what gets published and who publishes it. Yeah. And it gets edited. As you say, editorial meetings, people have their own idea of what's appropriate. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, when you think about how you've moved through the business and developed, what's changed for you?
I mean, the things I write are extremely different from the kinds of journalism that I was doing, for instance, in the 8 years that I worked for the Associated Press, which is a wire service, still exists. And it's still big, although it's shrinking like everything else. When I was at AP, there was like the word "I" never could have appeared in a story, right? When I would be in a situation, for instance, in Haiti, there's one example that I often call to. Well, basically anything that happened to me, I would write about it in the third person if it was important enough to include in a story, right? So if I was covering a riot as happened and I was robbed at a barricade, which I was at one point, I wrote about it in the third person. I was like an Associated Press reporter had his BlackBerry, stolen at a barricade at knife point or something like that. And
his hand is hurting while he is typing this.
Yes. Fortunately, my hand was fine. But yes, exactly. Things like that, right? It was. There was also a sort of. Certainly, there was a kind of defensive writing in a way, but it wasn't defensive against online sparring. It was defensive against, the parties of a story,
making sure the material facts.
Yeah. Not just that, but just like making sure that like we included, the point of view of, a person who is, even if an investigation showed, even the UN, my evidence shows that the UN is likely responsible for this cholera outbreak. Here's the UN's response, right? You had to have it in there, right? But it's different now. Like I'm much more of a poster after whatever it's been, 14 years of social media poisoning.
It's metastasized.
Yeah. And also, the things I write, I used to be a beat reporter. Even when I was a foreign correspondent, when I was in Israel during the Second Intifada, one of my first gigs actually at AP, I was covering that. When I was in Haiti, I was covering, I was very, very intense. Obviously, I've lived in Port-au-Prince. I was very intense on the Haiti story, and whatever was happening in Haiti, that was my beat. And I had sources who were placed, who I cultivated, and I would go out and I would observe things, and that was my focus. Whereas now, it, as has sort of developed, especially over the last 5 years, since I started doing my newsletter, first of all, it's much more of like a personal opinion section. Of the things I write are much more kind of like op-eds. I also write actual op-eds. That's a thing I would have never done as a reporter back in the day. And that allows me to be more opinionated. It allows me to offer things that I try to be well sourced. I try to have all my facts in order. I make a very great effort too. And this piece, the piece that brings me here today, contrary to some intimations and in some cases direct statements that have been made online, it was rigorously fact checked by the Atlantic's fact check team. And even before it gets to the Atlantic's fact check team, I am an obsessive self fact checker. I can tell you, for instance, in my books, my publishing houses don't hire fact checkers. I hire them out of my own pocket. For Gangsters of Capitalism, I hired 4 fact checkers, which was not cheap, because I gave them really good ones. One of whom is one of the head research editors of the New York Times Magazine. Before that, he was at the New Yorker. And I gave them, very specific marching orders, like destroy this book, find every weak point, find anything that might be, some kind of unintentional plagiarism, anything that I get wrong here, fight me on it. And there were fights with my own fact checkers who I was paying. That's how I operate. And that I think hasn't changed. But what I do with those facts, I'm then able to sort of, make arguments, which, 10, 15 years ago, maybe closing in on 15 years ago now, I would have been allergic to doing, like coming out in a story and saying that, this guy is this Haitian politician is very dangerous. Just sort of as my opinion, right? That's something I wouldn't have done. And that's changed because of social media. It changed in a lot of ways, because of the Trump years, because, with Donald Trump, as a journalist, I was faced with somebody who, it was very obvious to me, very much from the beginning of his first candidacy in 2015. And I cannot believe that we are in the middle of his third candidacy. That is crazy to me. It was very obvious to me what was going on, that this guy was trafficking in open racism, that he was selling himself as an authoritarian who, I alone, as he said at the Republican National Convention in 2016, can fix it. That it was that was what we were dealing with here. And a lot of my colleagues in the press, still to this day, a lot of my colleagues in the press, back then, there were huge fights over, like, if we could say that he was lying, right? People would be like, well, we don't know what's in his heart. Maybe he thinks these things are true. And so we can't call them lies. And it's like, I think we can call them lies, because either he knows he's lying in a lot of cases, or he doesn't because he's not bothering to check. But regardless, we know that this isn't true. So let's just call it a lie and just be clear about that. And things like that, in ways, sort of push me to a more aggressive, more opinionated, kind of, Matt Taibbi type of writing than I was doing before. One of the reasons that I really admired Taibbi over, back when I was sort of a straight news reporter, was because I would have loved to be able to write, I don't know about that line in particular, but, things like the vampire squid, line, right? I couldn't, I would have gotten fired. not just because I would have been, engaging in, ad hominem attacks or whatever. But just because it's not the kind of writing that AP does. AP would just be like, you can do that kind of writing, but you just have to go somewhere else to do it. And I always really admired people who could do things like that. And now I'm doing that to a much greater extent. Other ways in which I've changed are, I doubt very many people who are listening to this are very familiar with my work, but if they are and they've been reading me for many years, maybe they can tell me other ways in which I've changed that I'm not cognizant of. But those are some examples.
Well, I'm really grateful for you sharing that as openly as you did, because in a way, I suppose that's part of what has come up earlier when I was talking about a more adversarial bent in the way reporting is done. In a way, a greater sense of mission among a lot of journalists in terms of what they think they're trying to achieve with what they say and what they publish.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the question of trust, I guess that's also something that comes in here, as you brought up the Trump years. And I'd say it would be disingenuous to ignore that 2016 feels like an inflection point, right?
Oh, yeah.
That after 2016, with Trump and Brexit, and the kind of few years we had between that and the pandemic, it definitely felt like there was a kind of gloves off moment where suddenly, to the extent that objectivity was ever a real and meaningful outcome, it was previously ethically encouraged. And I think that's a reasonable point. And I feel like we shifted, as you described for yourself, into a more subjective mode, however understandably on a personal level.
Right.
But for many people, myself included, what that shift did do is perhaps affect the level of trust that's instinctively possible when you know someone is writing from a passionate, personally convictioned place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
yeah, I mean, my ideas about objectivity have also changed over the course of my career. And a lot of that actually has more to do with my experience as a foreign correspondent. Because I found myself, I reported from, I'm American, I reported from the United States. And before I went overseas for the longest stint, I was in Israel and Palestine before I then came back, and then I reported from Capitol Hill, first for Congressional Quarterly and then for the Associated Press. And broke actually a fairly big story at the time that the then Senate Majority Leader, Bill Frist, had sold off all of his family's stock, or all of his stock in his family's hospital company, right before a major price decline, in preparation for a presidential run. This seemed like a big story at the time because he was considered the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination in 2008, which people today would say, Bill who?
And wait, are we not allowed to be nostalgic for a time when insider trading by members of Congress was considered controversial?
A big story. I know. That's really, yeah. But then I moved overseas, and one of the things was that being, reporting from, especially in Latin America and especially in Haiti, I was expected to not necessarily sit in judgment, but to follow the facts wherever they led, especially when it came to talking about the Haitian government, in a way that when talking about American politics, you were much more expected to, the mode of objectivity, or what people considered objectivity, was much more of what has since been termed both sidesism, right? That just real quick, when you say expected, you mean by your editors, or you mean by management? By editors and also by audiences, right? Because it was like, if you said the Republicans are telling the truth and the Democrats are lying in this instance, then that is considered not objective by sort of the American rules of the game, and from American perspective, right? That seems like partisan journalism, right? Whereas when reporting on another country, People don't care because I'm reporting for a global audience. I'm reporting for especially an American audience with AP. People don't care about internal Haitian politics. I feel fairly confident that you probably can't name any Haitian political parties, which is it's not a moral failing on your part. You just don't know anything about it, which is fine. Like it's a big world out there. So like the idea that, I would, be, it's like, oh, you seems like you're really, in the tank for Unité, instead of PHTK, right? It's like, it's not a thing that like anyone's going to care about. Right. And so I was much more expected to just be like, well, what are the facts, man? Like what's happening here? And I followed that. I took that, I took that and ran with it. And we've brought it up a million times here, but like, certainly with regard to the earthquake, I didn't get the earthquake's comment on the 100,000 to 316,000 people that it killed.
The tectonic plate was unavailable.
The tectonic plate was the North American plate was unavailable for comment because it was sliding under the Caribbean plate. But then, even, throughout that year and throughout like the reporting that I was doing in Haiti in general, I just reported, I just reported critically on NGOs. I reported critically on the UN with the cholera epidemic. I reported very critically on Bill Clinton. One of sort of the moments in which I realized that perhaps I had been in Haiti too long and was a little burned out, but also it's kind of a mode that I've just been ever since, was when I interrupted Bill Clinton at one of his own press conferences in Haiti, because I asked a question and he started answering it, and I just interrupted him. I was like, that's not what I asked. Like and everyone else like kind of turned around, and I was like, stop lying to me, man. Like, it's like, and so it was a different vision. There's different ways to talk about it. To a certain extent, I came to reject neutrality. I came to reject both sidesism, but I became much more committed to following the facts wherever they led, regardless of who it pissed off, and regardless, honestly, of the professional or financial implications for me. And I think that for me, again, this may sound crazy. I don't even know who's still listening to this podcast at this point, but like, it may sound crazy, but like, so many people have accused me in writing this piece of like, oh, I did it for clout. Oh, I did it for money. And I did get paid for the article, to be perfectly fair. I didn't get paid like a ton. I didn't get paid an amount that's going to offset the number of subscriptions and the growth that I'm losing from leaving Substack. And I don't know if we have time, but I can talk about the reasons, because it wasn't just the Nazi thing. And in fact, that was in some ways subordinate to the reasons that I left the platform. But I shot where I ate. I don't care because it's the only way that I know how to work is if I find information and I think it's interesting and I think that it is in any way productive to report on it, in kind of a pro-social sense, I'm gonna do it, even if it makes me look bad, even if it hurts my bottom line, even if it means that I can't work at the places that I've been working. I mean, just to use another example, one of the first pieces that I did on my Substack, and I think one of the ones that went viral early on, was I reported, I did a piece in my Substack about the ways in which the New York Times, through some very shoddy reporting, had created the illusion of support for the notion that Donald Trump wasn't just making shit up when he said that there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, right? And I called out in my newsletter Jeremy Peters and the New York Times in general, because they had engaged in what I considered to be and what I found to be shoddy and incomplete reporting that created a false impression. At that time, my principal employer, I did not work for them, but as a freelancer, my principal client essentially was the New York Times. I mean, for years, I was effectively, like the New York Times's, North Carolina correspondent. And because I was there a lot and reporting from there a lot. And, I don't think it was just that. I don't think it was just that reporting, but sort of the cumulative effect of me calling out the New York Times and their reporting failures in my newsletter and on my social media account has had the effect that I don't really write very much for the New York Times anymore. And I can't, I don't know. I'm sure that my family would rather that I had made different decisions about things like that. But I can't operate any differently. It's the only way that I know how to operate. The only way I know how to operate as a journalist is to learn information, synthesize it, and whether I'm doing it in a straight news story or I'm doing it in a more opinionated piece, like put it out to the world without fear or favor, to use another journalistic cliche. And again, I'm sure people are going to be listening to this and being like, "You're completely full of shit, Katz. Like, what are you talking about?" But if I'm full of shit, then I'm bullshitting myself, because this is how I think I work, and it is, and to me, this story that we're here talking about is another example of it, because all it did was make enemies for me on Substack. It certainly did nothing to ingratiate myself to the Substack leadership, who run a social network in which they make editorial decisions about who to promote, who to ratchet up, who to recommend to people and who not. And ultimately, I decided, really on just like my own personal ethical grounds, that I couldn't be on Substack anymore, for which I am knowingly taking a financial hit, because the Substack network effect, which wasn't in place in the first couple of years that I was on Substack, does fuel a lot of growth. And I have no doubt that I am going to have fewer subscribers in a year than I would have if I had stayed on the platform. And other people are looking at the same information that I am. They maybe even agree with me. They agree with my position that it's you got to call out, and it is not good to have like actual like National Socialist Nazis on a newsletter platform, or being promoted by, or in the case of what Hamish McKenzie did that really shot him in the foot. And this was just a complete unforced error on his part, coming out with a statement in which he just said, like, we don't like Nazis, but they are welcome on our platform, which is something that no other social media organization, not even Elon Musk, who reinstated the accounts of known neo-Nazis, not even he was like, I think it's important to have Nazis on my platform. Like, Hamish McKenzie said that. It created headlines. It created a very bad effect. I got a lot of unsubscriptions, and other people did as well. I stirred that pot. I'm dealing with the consequences of that, but I don't care, because I think that it is important enough to note that there is a real and pervasive issue, and that I thought that it was important enough to do that, even though I think that ultimately it probably didn't win me a ton of friends, and it isn't going to make me a lot of money in the long run. It's actually going to cost me money in the short and medium term.
Something that seems to be at the heart of a lot of the contentiousness around conversations about who should be on a platform, who should be heard, who shouldn't be heard. It can be reduced to calling it a free speech issue, but it also ties in with things that have come up during our conversation about trust, about people speaking to each other across the lines of disagreement. And increasingly, also, we see worldwide a ramping up of government rules around what is being classed as hate speech or misinformation and so on. And I suppose, to me, besides my own personal feelings about freedom of speech, which probably veer towards the absolutist, there's also the fact that it seems like the best way of getting people to trust in the ecosystem in which they're receiving their information. And so, for example, is it better that Nazis only meet in a basement under a warehouse by the docks where nobody knows they're there or how many people are there? Or is it better that they have a list of subscribers on a database and everyone can go and see what they're saying to each other? And so, for example, like with the way we began and now moving towards wrapping up, shining a light on the fact that extremism, unsavory opinions, outright racism, and other stuff is there and is present and is concerning, and people who feel that way and think that way and speak that way, it's unpleasant to know that it's out there, especially if you're a member of one of the groups that they dislike. It can be scary, it's uncomfortable, and it can be downright disgusting. And maybe I'm being naive, but I still don't feel like any of that is a reason for it to be gone, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And I'm not saying that because I think it's an easy thing to say. I don't think it's a black and white issue, but to me, it kind of, we approach a bright line where countries that tend to be dangerous for the most vulnerable or for the people who are dissenting against the majority opinion or the government, countries that are dangerous in that way tend to be countries that limit what can be said and determine what the acceptable parameters of debate are, and also sometimes even determine what is true or what constitutes acceptable facts rather than unacceptable facts, right? Right. And it seems to me to be approaching worldwide a situation where there is a growing, often very emotional, often understandable from a certain perspective, dislike for so much of what goes on and gets said and causes distress to people, that we risk crossing a line from which we don't walk back easily into a situation where real power, the power that's enforced by military and police and the machinery of the state, real power gets to determine what people can and cannot say. And so, in a way, I think maybe some of the pushback and negativity you've received might be from people who, even if that wasn't your intention, kind of accuse you of being the thin end of a wedge.
Of course.
The other end of which is this thing I'm talking about. Right. And I don't think that concern is ill-founded, even if the way it's expressed to you or blaming you as if you're somehow in cahoots with some agenda is off-base. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I can respond to a couple different ways. So first of all, I think it's very important to sit in the discomfort and the ambiguity of all this, because it is very, very difficult. These are very, very difficult questions. I mean, just to use an example, and I believe this is a case that you're familiar with, of Rwanda, right? I mean, that's a situation where you had, mass media directly sparking, perpetuating, and giving marching orders to a genocide. Then that genocide ends. Everybody who's dead is not coming back. May they rest in peace. And the Kagame government comes into power, and then sort of on the pretense, and maybe pretense is too unfair word. Like they're basing this on real things that really happened with Radio Mikolin and things like that. But then they use that to then suppress speech that is critical of Kagame, who becomes a dictator, effectively. At least as an unaccountable authoritarian president. And to the extent that, people have written about this at length, even getting real information about the genocide in Rwanda is difficult because speech is so narrowly constrained, that even true facts about the genocide, right, which is perpetrated by the victims of the genocide, were to a great extent the people who are in power now. They because of fears of whatever they call it, genocidal ideation or division or whatever, divisiveness. They try to they restrict even talking about like ethnic or supposed ethnic differences within the Rwandan body politic in a way that makes it very difficult to even talk about like what happened, right? So that's just like a case where, and that's just an example of a case where like, what the hell do you do with that, right? Because like on the one hand, and like I can tell you, like I'm familiar with some of the discourse around it. I know that some people, like I was reading a thing. It was like freedom of whatever it is. I forget.
Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Greg Lukianoff. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Fire. I wrote a thing. I read this a little while ago. So if I'm misremembering it, please correct me or forgive me. But they made a point that was sort of like, but like what Radio Milcolin did was like, it wouldn't have passed the Brandenburg test, right? Referring to the Supreme Court case, in which, speech could only be prohibited by the American state if there is if they're fighting words that mean an imminent threat of like specific violence against specific individuals. Like in the Brandenburg case, like not even just sort of like, because Brandenburg, the guy, is just, I don't remember exactly what it was, basically just sort of like, we must kill like blacks and Jews. But they were like, it like in the case of Rwanda, like they were like, and this is the address of, these are the names of the people. And so Fire is saying like, this isn't really even a question of freedom of speech because Brandenburg would hold. But of course, at that point, now you're getting into, well, Brandenburg is itself, like if you're talking about free speech absolutism, like Brandenburg, if you're a real free speech absolutist, like 100%, then even Brandenburg should be too far for you, because then you're against anybody saying anything, right? All I'm trying to say here, and maybe people are going to accuse me of, see, I'm talking defensively here. Maybe people are going to accuse me of being intentionally obfuscating or obtuse or talking around this issue. But these are very, very complicated issues, right? Talk about Nazis on Substack specifically. Talk about the thing that we're actually talking about here, right? The actual Nazis, the Nazis qua Nazis, right? The clicking heels, swastika sporting Nazis. And even sort of like the larger group of, just sort of white supremacists and people who are people who are part of neo-Nazi movements, even though they don't have swastikas on their Substack, but they're very clearly identified and we know who they are. I talk about some of them in the Atlantic piece because they were in Charlottesville. They're defendants in Sines v. Kessler, the case against the perpetrators of Unite the Right. In those cases, like what they want ultimately, what that political tendency wants, is to become an authoritarian super state in which they get to decide what everybody else says and who is suffered to live and who can be killed at will. And this is a very famous issue, and there are different people. Karl Popper, there's different people with different opinions about this, about like, so what do you do if, the people who are trying to use free speech, claims of free speech are trying to use that as a thin wedge to get themselves in. And especially given the fact that, that it is very clear to me that there is a large and powerful authority. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a Nazi. Okay. I am saying that there is within the Republican Party, first of all, he's an authoritarian who wants to be a singular authoritarian. And there is a large and growing wave of people with a various spectrum of authoritarian ideas that go all the way to, Ron DeSantis's campaign having these underground videos that were made by and approved by the campaign that included Nazi iconography, right? So like, that's real, right? So that's a thin wedge of its own. I don't know the answer in a broader societal sense, right? About whether, the answer to that is, I feel like it is not criminalizing speech. I think that I am maybe this is my bias as an American or my bias as a journalist who grew up really like revering the First Amendment. But like, I don't see that as an answer, right? But I do think that it is a lot more within the realm of conversation if we're talking about a platform like Substack, not allowing itself to be used as a fundraising tool and also as a dissemination tool, not just because it is using sort of the power of the internet or Twitter-like powers to just like put stuff out there in the ether, but it is email delivery. It is infrastructure to create mailing lists and disseminate views. And like, yeah, Nazis like have a right to talk. And you say like it's better to have them out in the open. First of all, like I don't know the extent to which they're out in the open. I mean, one of the criticisms, and I know that Elle Griffin made this criticism of my piece on your podcast. She was like, "Well, I wouldn't have even known that these people exist if Jonathan Katz hadn't found them." Which, first of all, I don't think that just because you don't know something exists doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and just because you know it exists doesn't mean that it's not important. But also that kind of obviates your point, because like a lot of people just didn't know that they were out there until I shone a light on it. Like you in that interview, you used the Louis Brandeis line, that the sunlight is the best disinfectant, and he goes on to talk about publicity. Like, I'm bringing like that was what my piece was doing. I was bringing sunlight into a dank corner of Substack and shining a light on it. And I don't, we could talk about the origins of that idea and its limits, but like, regardless, like insofar as it's a thing, like that's what I was doing. And the other thing is, and this also goes into even, one's reverence for or absolutism for the First Amendment. There are, and I talk about this in the Atlantic piece, and since it is Substack has a First Amendment right to allow anything on its platform that it wants and to disallow anything on its platform that it wants, because there's Supreme Court cases. There was a famous one involving the Miami Herald in the 1970s, where the state of Florida tried to mandate that the Miami Herald publish a response to an op-ed, I believe it was. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't force a publication to print anything. Because that is its First Amendment right. It's its right of free speech. It's its freedom of the press. It is its freedom of association.
Well, that's compelled speech, right? So essentially compelling speech is as unfree as restricted speech.
Exactly. So in the case of Substack, and again, I'm going back to sort of my initial ambiguities. I don't know what to do with all this stuff. Some of these cases are just so obvious that I think is just obvious. And even Substack, after coming out and making a statement that ended up with a headline in the New York Times that had the word Substack and Nazi next to it, each other, where it was basically Substack welcomes Nazis, right? Even after that, Substack then had to backpedal and be like, well, these guys, and it was 5 sites, right? But they were like, okay. So there are 5 sites that are like, yeah, it's pretty bad. Pretty bad. Okay, I got that. I got now where you're going from. So like even they had to be like that. There's other things that are just sort of like, yes, well, you're trafficking anti-Semitism. You have a huge subscriber base. You're making a bunch of money, or you are literally Richard Spencer and you have a Substack bestseller badge, or you are literally a front for a no neo-Nazi group that also has a Substack bestseller badge. Like, what do you do with that? I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I do not have a good answer. But what I do know is that talking about it in terms, I just think that like in terms of sort of the narrow case that you're making, that it's better to know where they are, that it's better to know who they are. I don't agree, because I don't think, first of all, that putting the power of a platform behind them is necessary. I don't think allowing them to make money is necessary. I don't think that I don't see an argument in which like,
but I mean the making money thing. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but just to kind of to step into what you were saying.
Yeah,
I think that the making money angle, it goes to places that may seem like it's a slippery slope argument, but I don't believe it's disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
Before there was an internet, there were newsletters.
Yeah.
Newsletters that were printed on paper that was bought from stores.
Yeah.
Printed in printers' shops that sold the service that they did. Sent through the post in envelopes that were bought from stationery stores using stamps that were bought from the post office. You know what else Nazis use? Electricity.
Yeah.
They wear shoes.
Yes.
It's, I find it, for me, it's a queasy thing when we begin to think about the idea that essentially making money from fellow citizens who hold unacceptable opinions should be socially unacceptable and or legally prevented. I'm not saying you're taking that position.
But I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be illegal. I just don't think that. I don't think that it should be. That I don't. Let me put it this way. I don't think it should be illegal at all. I don't think that. I just don't want to be associated with a platform that says you can do it here, right? Like it's one thing to, make your own server, put your own email list together, send your email out to people, and they can Venmo you money, whatever. Like, if you want to do that, that's fine. And also there are other platforms out there that allow that sort of thing. Substack is one of them, very explicitly now. But like
Substack and Beehive that you switch to may very well share something like AWS, which is the back end for a lot of internet companies.
Yes.
This is what I mean. It's a kind of, once we go, and I'm not suggesting that you haven't thought of that or that you're yada yadaing that, but just that's what I mean. When we really open up that can of worms, when we really walk through that door, it just feels a lot like a kind of, and again, I'm not putting this on you. It's my impression. Right. A kind of social credit thing.
So a loaded term, but yes.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I use it advisedly in the sense that what I mean by it is a situation in which the social acceptability and the general public or government approval of one's behavior and statements and actions begins to govern the degree to which you can actually live your life in society and interface with society economically and autonomously.
Right.
I think that once we open that can of worms, once we walk through that door, we are really not making a different argument to that. We're just talking about degree, not framework, if you see what I mean. Because I don't think,
to a certain extent, but I mean, there are other ways of looking at this and talking about it. I mean, it's, if putting yourself out there as a platform on which literal Nazis, I mean, and Hamish said this, right? Literal Nazis are welcome to grow their email lists, monetize, make money. That is a message to other people, including people who Nazis victimize, that maybe you're not welcome here. And maybe Substack isn't saying like, you as a trans person, you as a person of color, whatever, you as a Jewish person, like you can't come here and do the same thing, but you just might not feel welcome on it. You might feel, and your subscriber base or your potential subscriber base may not feel welcome supporting you. And part of the reason is because it's not just that these are competing ideas and competing worldviews. Like the thing that, and the reason why the reason why Nazis and free speech intersect in these conversations so often is because it is such a strong and very clear example of a violently illiberal worldview whose ultimate goal is mass murder, or at least the forcible legal exclusion using the resources of the state of people with whom it disagrees or with whom it thinks shouldn't exist or shouldn't exist within the country in which they find themselves. And once you and the problem is, and this is why it's such fertile ground for debate, and like, what do you do with that? Like, the problem is that, like, once you and as a social network, Substack is a social network. They have recommendation features. They have a Twitter clone. They make recommendations. They have their own podcasts. They have their own newsletters in which they recommend places. Once you have that infrastructure saying, we think that we should both have, we should have people who like write about croqueting, and we should also we should also have people who want to murder all Jews. And like at that point,
people who read Knitting Weekly also read Death to the Jews.
Right. You can't, like, those two things can't exist in the same place. They can't.
You don't think so?
No.
That's I suppose that's really, in a way, I guess.
Well, the knitting, yes, but because you can have Nazi knitters, right? But what I'm saying is,
crochet patterns for knitted swastikas,
yeah. But what I'm saying is that at a certain point, you have to choose. And I don't think I like when I say in the same place, we're talking about a platform. Like, I'm not talking about in a society. Like, within a society, you know. The problem is it's when that liberal authoritarian fascist group gains enough purchase, gains enough numbers, gains enough material, and with an E, right? Like enough armament, enough political power that they can actually start putting some of their views into practice. At that point, you can't have both, right? Like if we're talking about like actual like Nazi Germany, right, or like pre-Nazi Germany, like,
you mean an ideology that gains enough momentum and backing that it can capture all of the institutions and mechanisms that would otherwise protect people from it, and it becomes impossible to coexist.
Yeah.
Because
at that point you don't have a liberal society anymore.
But that was also true, for example, of the Bolshevik takeover in Russia that became communist Russia and the Soviet Union.
Yes.
It was the case in many countries with various dictatorships, not all of which would be characterized as right-wing.
Right, yes.
But all of whom, in a way, and this is the beauty of Orwell's work and the reason behind the name, in part, they obeyed certain mechanical or structural similarities.
Yes. No, I mean, there's a reason why Hannah Arendt coined the term totalitarianism to basically describe both Stalin and Hitler, because they had a lot in common, and they were allies for a while, and they jointly invaded Poland. I mean, this is, yes, of course.
But I guess what I mean is, by bringing that up, it's not, and again, it's not to tar with a broad brush, but simply to say that there are a number of organizations that speak either openly and passionately about their alignment with, say, for example, communist ideas or Marxist ideas, all of which, in their way, if taken to the same logical conclusion that we're describing Nazism is going to, entail a lot of the same elements: the inability to coexist with liberal ideas, mass murder of individuals who disagree, and so on and so forth. We don't see a pushback or an anxiety around those organizations simply because they identify as Marxist or communist or anarchist and so on to the same way. And like you said earlier, because Nazis...
Well, anarchism, to use a specific example, is quite literally the opposite of that, right? Is that they're against state control.
Yeah. I agree. I guess what I mean is I put it in there because in the sense of a kind of direct action anarchist movement of the removal of a central authority in a country, that obviously entails the removal of any structures that have guarantees for individuals that were enjoying protections that central authority was providing.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I guess very briefly, the thing that I would say is I think that, at least from my point of view, the reason why I'm more exercised about right-wing authoritarianism is because it is a much more salient political force in American life today, and because you have these massacres at an El Paso Walmart, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, at the grocery store in Buffalo, etc. I'm not seeing, maybe they're out there and I don't know about them, but like I'm not aware of like Stalinist purge. I don't even know what it would be, because they have no political power. If that was an issue, then we could talk about it. I'm sure if Orwell was alive, he would want to talk about it. But I feel like, I don't mean to ventriloquize Eric Blair, but he was also very clear that on a war footing, he was okay with certain types of censorship because it supported an effort to remove a greater evil. Yeah. He wasn't an absolutist either. That's a reasonable point. The upshot of this whole thing at the end of 2023 on Substack is that the head of the platform made a very public statement that Nazis are welcome, literal Nazis, he used the word, are welcome on the platform. And that he thinks that the best thing is to allow them to build up email lists and write publications and make money. There were many that I found. People have said that I found 16. No, I found 16 that had swastikas and sonorans in them. There were many more than that, explicitly Nazi sites. And the ones that I was reviewing, that traffic in extremism and anti-Semitism and hateful ideology like that it's a much larger list, and people have come to me and found even more sense. What I would say is that number is only going to grow, and at some point, I hate to think this, but at some point, my fear is that we're going to see something like Christchurch or Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh massacre, or something like that happening, except instead of the manifesto or the author posting on 4chan or 8kun or wherever, that it's going to be on Substack. And the reason why I left Substack, ultimately, it was partially because of that, and because I just didn't want to be associated with this thing anymore. And also because I felt that Hamish, the thing that he did that really pissed me off was sharing private conversation with Casey Newton, who is one of his most esteemed and celebrated, literally the icon on the Substack, the sample page of the Substack app on the App Store and Google Play. He took an internal communication with Casey and gave it to Michael Schellenberger's and sometimes Matt Taibbi's publication, because he thought that it would make Casey look bad. And that's not illegal behavior. That's not, maybe it's not even immoral, but I think it's very unethical, and it just made me not trust him. And I just didn't want anything to do with that anymore. And so all of these things, I mean, that's what I would say. That's what I would say. I mean, yes, we could talk about Stalinism. I have a lot of things to say about it, but the threat in America and in the West right now, is from a very specific kind of authoritarianism, that happens to be on the right. And so that's what we're seeing a lot more of. It's not a surprise to me that I would have found a lot more. I didn't find any, but I'm sure there's some Stalinist newsletter. I have no idea. In fact, some of the Nazis use like communist iconography because they do this like third positionist thing. Anyway, I gotta go. I'm sorry.
No, Jonathan, thank you. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Yeah. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I hope it's been interesting and valuable for you also. And,
it's been a great conversation. I look forward to seeing what you do with this, and hopefully people will react to it in the respectful and measured and intellectually exchanging tone that we have tried to display here.
Oh,
I don't know. My hopes aren't amazingly high for that, but I hope we see that.
Well, what was it they said about the Nuremberg trials, that it was the greatest tribute ever paid by passion to reason, something like that. So I think we have something to aspire to there. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank Jonathan Katz for joining me, and of course all of you for listening. Please check the show notes to find links to Jonathan's work. You can also check out our website, 1984.today, for ways you can support the podcast. Of course, the biggest thing you can do is share it, talk about it, maybe leave a comment to give your own thoughts on what we've discussed. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, keep the fire burning. We'll be back with more fuel next time. Goodbye.